Picture this nightmarish scene unfolding in the market square of Rouen, May 30th, 1431. The fire has burned itself out 3 times already, but the executioner, named Geoffroy Terrage, is absolutely panicking. He's a professional killer, a man who burns heretics and criminals for a living, but he's never encountered anything like this. He has just burned the prisoner 3 separate times in a row, using enough oil and sulfur to melt iron bars. The stench of burning flesh has long since cleared, yet the physical evidence he was ordered to completely destroy refuses to disappear. Pushing aside the charred wood with trembling hands, he stares down in absolute horror at what remains in the debris. There, sitting in the ash and bone fragments, is the heart. It is red, still full of blood, and completely untouched by the flames that consumed everything else. It looks like it was just cut from a living body moments ago. Terrified that the massive mob watching from the square will see this as an undeniable miracle and riot, Geoffroy grabs the still warm organ with his bare hands, shoves it desperately into a burlap sack, along with whatever ashes he can gather, and runs through the crowd to the Mathilde Bridge. He hurls the entire mess into the muddy waters of the River Seine below. He watches the current swallow the last physical trace of Joan of Arc, hoping the evidence sinks and stays buried. Before we dive into the extraordinary story of how an illiterate teenage farm girl broke the medieval world, smash that like button and subscribe to Map Room Battles for more forgotten stories that challenge everything you think you know about history. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It's incredible. We're exploring this 600-year-old mystery together across continents, connected by our need to understand how one person can change the course of empires. Geoffroy the executioner later collapsed in his home, reportedly weeping, convinced he had murdered a genuine saint and damned his own soul to hell. But his English paymasters didn't care about his spiritual crisis or his conscience. They cared only about containment and narrative control. They needed this 19-year-old peasant girl to be absolutely, irrevocably deleted from existence, not just killed, but erased. They didn't just want Joan of Arc dead. They wanted her memory destroyed, her legend prevented, her example eliminated. This level of existential fear from a military superpower requires an explanation. Empires do not usually panic over illiterate teenage girls from nowhere. Kingdoms don't spend fortunes and risk riots to execute farm workers. But Joan was fundamentally different. She was a glitch in the medieval matrix, an error in the code of feudal society. In the rigid hierarchy of the 15th century, God chose kings, kings chose generals, and peasants obeyed without question. That was the unbreakable order of things. Joan grabbed a sword and short-circuited the entire system. She forced the English military machine, the most advanced, disciplined fighting force in Europe, to look at an illiterate farm girl and see an existential monster that had to be destroyed at any cost. To understand this fear, to comprehend why they needed her erased, we have to examine the world that created her. Forget the romantic paintings of noble knights and fairy tale castles you see in museums. The France of 1412, the year Joan was born, was an active slaughterhouse. The 100 Years' War had been grinding on for 3 brutal generations, turning the countryside into a graveyard. Wolves were literally entering the city of Paris at night to drag corpses out of shallow graves, because there were so many dead the gravediggers couldn't keep up. The French king Charles VI was clinically insane, genuinely convinced he was made of glass and would shatter into pieces if anyone touched him. The crown treasury was bankrupt. The professional army was broken. The country was split in a vicious civil war between 2 rival factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, who hated each other more than they hated the English invaders. Hope was not just in short supply. It was extinct. The people had resigned themselves to a slow, painful death as an English colony. Their independence was over. Then, in the muddy village of Domremy, on the far eastern border, a 13-year-old girl named Jeanne stopped playing in her father's garden. She stood completely still. She looked toward the village church with wide eyes. She listened carefully. She didn't hear the wind in the trees or the birds singing. She heard a voice giving her a command that would eventually lead her to the fire in Rouen. The impossible was about to begin. To understand the Savior, you first have to understand the hell she was born into. The rot started at the very top of French society. In 1420, the throne of France was occupied by Charles VI, a man known to history by the tragic epithet Charles the Mad. His psychosis was not a shameful secret hidden from public view. It was a national tragedy, a disaster everyone knew about. During his episodes of madness, which could last for months, he forgot his own name. He forgot he was king. He refused to bathe for months at a time, his body covered in filth. Most famously and bizarrely, he suffered from a persistent delusion that he was made of glass. He genuinely believed that if someone bumped into him, he would shatter into 1,000 pieces. He had iron rods sewn into his clothing to prevent himself from breaking. With a glass king on the throne who couldn't even recognize his own wife, the wolves of the nobility began to circle the weakened crown. The French aristocracy did not unite to protect their sovereign or their country. Instead, they tore each other apart in a savage civil war. Two powerful factions emerged, transforming the country into a slaughterhouse. The Armagnacs supported the legitimate royal line and the Dauphin. The Burgundians, driven by revenge and ambition, allied themselves with the English invaders. This was not a polite political disagreement settled in council chambers. It was a blood feud. In 1419, the leader of the Burgundians, John the Fearless, was assassinated on a bridge during what was supposed to be a peace meeting with the Dauphin, the future Charles VII. The Dauphin's men hacked John to death with axes while he knelt unarmed in supposed truce. That single act of treacherous violence destroyed any remaining chance of French unity. Seeking revenge for his father's murder, John's son Philip the Good did the absolutely unthinkable. He handed the keys of the kingdom to England, France's mortal enemy. The result was the infamous Treaty of Troyes in 1420. This document was effectively the death certificate of independent France, signed by the mad King Charles VI, who likely had no idea what he was doing, and the conquering English King Henry V. It declared that upon Charles VI's death, the French crown would not pass to his legitimate son, the Dauphin. Instead, it would pass directly to the King of England. The Dauphin was officially disinherited, publicly declared a bastard, and permanently banned from succession. Legally, France ceased to exist as an independent nation. It was now just a large English province, waiting for the legal paperwork to clear. This geopolitical nightmare at the top trickled down to the muddy reality of the peasantry at the bottom. Enter Domremy, Joan's village. This was not the idyllic pastoral setting often depicted in romantic movies. It was a localized war zone. Domremy was a tiny, vulnerable island of Armagnac loyalty, completely surrounded by hostile Burgundian territory. The villagers lived in a state of constant, low-level terror. They slept with weapons close and one eye open. When the warning bells rang from the church tower, they didn't waste time praying. They grabbed their cattle and children and ran desperately to a fortified island in the middle of the river to hide from raiding parties. Joan didn't grow up in peace. She grew up watching smoke rise from neighboring towns being burned. She saw the refugees streaming past with everything they owned. She knew intimately the smell of burning thatch and the sound of screaming. The 100 Years' War wasn't a story told by traveling minstrels to her. It was the reason her father, Jacques d'Arc, fortified their stone house. In this environment of chaos and despair, the Dauphin Charles, the man she would eventually fight for, was a distant, pathetic figure hiding in the south. He was cowering in the Loire Valley, paralyzed by indecision and crippling self-doubt. He was a king without a crown, a leader without an army, and a man without a spine. His enemies openly mocked him as the King of Bourges, a cruel joke, meaning he was a ruler of nothing important. The English held Paris, the capital. The Burgundians held the wealthy East. The English army, arguably the most disciplined and technologically advanced fighting force in all of Europe, was slowly and methodically tightening the noose around the remaining French territories. They were preparing for the final strike that would cross the Loire River and crush the last resistance. Cold military logic dictated that France was finished. The mathematics was simple and brutal. England had the money, the professional soldiers, and the momentum. France had a madman, a coward, and a civil war. Into this vacuum of leadership and hope, something else had to step in to fill the void. If mortal men could not save France from destruction, perhaps something supernatural would. Back in Domremy, the 13-year-old girl standing in the garden was about to receive her marching orders from heaven. But these divine voices didn't tell her to pray or fast or become a nun. They told her to fight. The first time it happened, she was 13 years old. It was noon on a summer day in 1425. Joan was in her father's garden in Domremy, likely spinning wool or tending to the vegetable patch. The sun was high and bright. The air was completely still. Suddenly, without warning, a blinding light appeared on her right side, coming from the direction of the village church. Along with the overwhelming light came a voice clear, commanding, undeniable. Joan was absolutely terrified by the experience. This was not a comforting religious vision like saints describe. It was an invasion of her reality, a shattering of normal experience. She later testified under oath that she was very much afraid the first time, but the voice was noble and beautiful, and she genuinely believed it came from God Himself. Over the following months and years, the light returned again and again. The figures within it gradually sharpened and became recognizable. She identified them specifically as Saint Margaret, Saint Catherine of Alexandria, and most importantly for what was to come, the Archangel Michael. The choice of Michael is theologically significant. In medieval Catholic theology, Michael was not a passive messenger delivering news. He was the captain of the heavenly host, the warrior angel who personally threw Lucifer out of heaven. He was the patron saint of the French royal army. For a teenage girl living in an active war zone, his appearance wasn't random chance. It was a military recruitment from heaven itself. These divine visions did not speak in confusing riddles or vague prophecies. They gave her specific, actionable intelligence like a military briefing. At first, during the early years, they told her simply to be a good girl and attend church regularly. But as she physically matured, the commands escalated dramatically. They became political. They became strategic. They became military. By the time she reached 16 years old, the message was no longer about personal piety or spiritual development. It was a clear mission statement with 3 impossible objectives. First, she had to leave her village and go to Robert de Baudricourt, the local garrison commander in Vaucouleurs. Second, she had to personally escort the Dauphin to Reims Cathedral to be properly crowned king. Third, she had to drive the English invaders completely out of France. Consider the absurdity of these commands. A peasant girl in the rigidly hierarchical 15th century could not even leave her village without her father's explicit permission. She had never ridden a war horse. She had never held a sword. She didn't know the difference between a military flank and a vanguard. She had never seen a battle. Yet the voice of the archangel told her directly, "Daughter of God, you must lead armies." Joan argued back with the voice. She told it honestly. "I am a poor girl. I do not know how to ride horses or fight in wars." The voice simply replied with absolute authority, "It is God who commands it. You will do it." The psychological pressure on this teenager was immense and unrelenting. She carried this terrifying secret for years, living a double life. She was terrified of her father Jacques d'Arc. He had actually had a prophetic dream that Joan would run away with soldiers. He told her brothers in front of her that if that ever happened, they were to drown her in the river. If they refused, he would do it himself with his own hands. So for years, Joan lived split between two worlds. By day, she was the dutiful daughter, working in the fields, spinning wool and sewing. By night, she was in secret council with the generals of heaven, receiving military orders. But in 1428, the war arrived literally at her doorstep. The English and Burgundians raided the Meuse Valley again with unusual violence. The time for hiding was over. The voices became urgent, almost desperate. They told her she could no longer remain safely in Domremy. "Go," the voice commanded. "Go into France. Go now." She had no money. She had no weapons. She had no army. She had no training. But she possessed something far more dangerous than any of those. She possessed absolute, unshakable certainty. She convinced her uncle Durand Laxart to take her to the nearby garrison town of Vaucouleurs. She was about to knock on the door of the military establishment and demand an armed escort to see the king. The girl was gone. The soldier had arrived. She arrived at the garrison town of Vaucouleurs in early 1429, wearing a simple red dress and seeking an audience with the military commander, Robert de Baudricourt. It went exactly as you would expect. Baudricourt was a hardened professional soldier who had spent decades fighting off English and Burgundian raids. When this peasant girl told him calmly that she had been sent by God to save France, he didn't fall to his knees in reverence. He laughed in her face. He told her uncle to take her home and give her a good beating to knock the delusions out of her head. But Joan didn't leave. She stayed in the town, living with a wheelwright's family, attending Mass every single day, and simply wearing down the resistance of the locals through sheer persistence. Her conviction was infectious, almost hypnotic. While the commander continued to mock her, his soldiers and knights began to listen. 2 knights of minor nobility, Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy, were the first to convert to her cause. Jean de Metz approached her and asked directly, "Must the king be driven from the kingdom, and are we to become English?" Joan looked him straight in the eye and delivered a line that sealed her fate. "I must be with the king before mid-Lent, even if I must wear my legs down to the knees. For there is no one in the world, neither king nor duke nor anyone else, who can recover the kingdom of France. There is no help except from me." Sensing the dangerous shift in public opinion toward this girl, Baudricourt finally relented under pressure. He gave her a sword, a horse, and an armed escort of 6 men, but he washed his hands of the consequences. "Go then," he said, "and let come what may." Before leaving Vaucouleurs, Joan made a decision that would later become the central piece of evidence at her heresy trial. She cut off her long hair in a short bowl cut and put on men's clothing, a tunic, hose, and boots. This was not just for disguise or convenience. It was for survival. Riding 350 dangerous miles through enemy Burgundian territory as a teenage girl was a mathematical guarantee of sexual assault and probably murder. Dressing as a male soldier was pragmatic armor against rape. It was a drag performance necessitated by war. The journey to Chinon, where the Dauphin was hiding, took 11 grueling days. They rode primarily at night to avoid detection, wrapping the horses' hooves in cloth to muffle the sound. Slipping carefully through Burgundian patrol lines, they slept on the frozen ground. Her escorts later admitted under oath that they were tempted multiple times to throw her into a quarry and abandon the insane mission to save themselves the trouble. But something about her stamina stopped them. She never complained. She never tired. She prayed constantly. When they finally arrived at the royal court in Chinon, the Dauphin Charles VII was deeply skeptical of this claiming prophet. He was a man psychologically crippled by doubt. His own mother, Queen Isabeau, had publicly claimed he was illegitimate, the product of an affair, not the true son of the king. If he wasn't the genuine heir, he had absolutely no right to the crown. Everything was built on sand. He decided to test this supposed prophet. Charles deliberately hid himself among the crowd of 300 courtiers. He placed a different nobleman on the throne to act as a decoy. The great hall doors opened. Joan walked in. She had never seen a king in her entire life. She had no idea what Charles looked like. She ignored the impressive man on the throne completely, walked straight through the crowd to the man hiding nervously in the corner, knelt before him, and said clearly, "God give you life, gentle king." Charles pointed to the man on the throne and lied, "I am not the king. There is the king." Joan didn't even blink. She replied with complete certainty, "In the name of God, noble prince, it is you and no other." The court went completely silent, but Charles still wasn't convinced. He took her aside for a private conversation. No one knows exactly what was said in that room, but witnesses saw the Dauphin's face transform. He went from looking bored and cynical to looking radiant with hope. The leading historical theory is that Joan revealed a secret prayer Charles had made to God completely alone, asking desperately for a sign of his legitimacy. She confirmed what he needed to hear. "You are the true heir of France and the son of a king." But words were not enough for the suspicious court. The royal council needed to ensure she wasn't a witch sent by the devil to trick them into damnation. A formal commission of theologians interrogated her for weeks at Poitiers, asking endless questions about her voices, her mission, her understanding of theology. Then came the most invasive test of all. Joan was subjected to a humiliating physical examination by a panel, including the Queen of Sicily, Yolande of Aragon, and other noble women. They were searching her body for physical signs of corruption or devil's marks. In the twisted logic of medieval theology, a witch gained her power through sexual relations with demons. A virgin could not be a witch. The reasoning was bizarre, but it was accepted law. The medical report came back. Joan was a virgin. She was physically intact. With the theology cleared and the biology verified, Charles VII had run out of excuses. He gave the illiterate 19-year-old teenager a suit of custom white armor, a battle standard painted with lilies and the words Jesus, Maria, and effective command of the army. The Maid of Orleans was born. When Joan arrived at the besieged city of Orleans in late April 1429, the situation was desperate. The city was suffocating. The English had surrounded it with a ring of fortified bastilles, slowly starving the inhabitants into submission. The French commander defending the city was Jean, Count of Dunois, known to history as the Bastard of Orleans. He was a competent, cautious, professional soldier. His plan was to use Joan as a mascot, a morale-boosting cheerleader, to inspire the troops, while the real men did the actual fighting. He was catastrophically wrong. Joan didn't come to wave a flag from a safe distance. She came to take command and fight. Her first act was to dictate a letter to the King of England she couldn't write, so a scribe recorded her words. It wasn't a diplomatic note. It was an eviction notice. "King of England," she wrote, "render account to the King of Heaven for your royal blood. Surrender to the maid the keys of all the good cities which you have seized. I am sent by God to drive you out of France. If you do not obey, I will make such a war cry that will be remembered forever." The English commanders laughed when they read it. They shouted back from their fortress walls, calling her a cowgirl and a whore. They promised to burn her alive if they ever caught her. Inside the city, the friction between Joan and the professional generals sparked immediately. Dunois wanted to play it safe, waiting for reinforcements and supplies. Joan woke up one afternoon from a nap, furious to discover that a skirmish had started without her knowledge. She rushed to the walls in a rage. She didn't understand complex logistics. She didn't care about supply lines or strategic reserves. Her military strategy was brutally simple and entirely modern. Locate the enemy, close the distance, and strike until they stop moving. On May 7th, 1429. The primary target was Les Tourelles, the fortified gatehouse controlling the bridge into the city. It was the linchpin of the entire English siege. The French generals hesitated, arguing that a direct assault on a stone fortress across a river was suicide. Joan didn't wait for permission. She jumped on her horse, grabbed a scaling ladder, and led the charge herself. The fighting was medieval combat at its ugliest, a chaos of arrows, boiling oil, stones, and axes in the mud. Then disaster struck. As Joan was scaling the wall, an English longbowman on the ramparts spotted the distinctive white armor. He took careful aim and loosed an arrow. It slammed into Joan with tremendous force, piercing her armor and burying itself 6 inches deep in her shoulder just above the breast. She fell backward into the ditch, screaming. A massive cheer went up from the English lines. The witch was down. They believed the Spinat was broken. French morale collapsed instantly. Dunois ordered an immediate retreat. The battle was over. They had lost. But in the field hospital behind the lines, something remarkable was happening. Joan was not dying quietly. She was weeping from the intense pain, yes, but she absolutely refused to quit the field. She had the arrow pulled out. Some sources say she pulled it out herself, with her own hands, gritting her teeth. She slapped a crude compress of olive oil and lard on the bleeding wound, confessed her sins to a priest in case she died, and then did the impossible. She put her armor back on over the bandage. As the French troops were dragging themselves away from Les Tourelles in defeat, heads down, they suddenly saw her battle standard rising again on the horizon. Joan rode back to the edge of the moat, blood seeping through her armor. The sight of this teenage girl, covered in her own blood, returning from what should have been death, psychologically broke the English soldiers. They were no longer fighting a human being. They were fighting a ghost, a demon, something supernatural. "The witch is back!" they screamed in terror. Panic spread like a virus through their ranks. The English commander, William Glasdale, who had mocked her just hours earlier, tried to retreat in panic across the wooden drawbridge. The structure, overloaded with terrified men in heavy plate armor, suddenly snapped. Glasdale fell into the river and drowned, weighed down by his steel. Joan reportedly wept for his soul, but she took his fortress. The siege of Orléans, which had dragged on for 6 months, was broken in just 4 days. The English retreated in disorder. The myth of their invincibility was shattered by a teenager with a hole in her shoulder. Europe was in shock. After Orléans, the fundamental physics of the war changed. For decades, the English had been the predators. Now, they were the prey. Joan didn't give them time to breathe or regroup. She urged the hesitant generals to launch an immediate lightning campaign along the Loire River. This was the blitzkrieg of the Middle Ages. In one single week, the French army smashed through Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, and Beaugency. The English retreat turned into a rout. But the real reckoning happened on June 18th, 1429, at the Battle of Patay. For 100 years, the English longbowmen had been the grim reaper of French chivalry. At Agincourt and Crécy, they had slaughtered French knights by the thousands, turning battlefields into abattoirs. But at Patay, the script was completely flipped. The French vanguard, led by La Hire and the Duke of Alençon, caught the English archers completely unprepared before they could plant their defensive stakes in the ground and form their killing formation. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. The French heavy cavalry thundered into the vulnerable, unprotected archers. The English army was annihilated in less than an hour. Over 2,000 English soldiers died. The French lost only 3 men. The invincibility of the English military machine was left rotting in the fields. Yet, with the road open, Joan insisted on the most politically dangerous move yet, a march deep into enemy Burgundian territory to Reims Cathedral. Medieval tradition dictated that a king of France was not truly legitimately king until he was anointed with the sacred oil at Reims. But Reims was deep inside hostile Burgundian territory. The professional generals called it suicide. They wanted to consolidate control of the Loire Valley first. Joan overruled them with absolute authority. "We go to Reims," she said. What followed was the bloodless march. As the royal army approached city after city, towns that had sworn loyalty to the English and Burgundians, Troyes, Chalons, Reims itself simply opened their gates without a fight. They didn't surrender to Charles's army. They surrendered to Joan's legend. They were terrified of the witch, or awed by the saint, depending on who you asked. The resistance evaporated. On July 17th, 1429, the impossible happened in the Grand Cathedral of Reims. Charles VII was anointed with the holy oil. He was no longer the Dauphin or the King of Bourges. He was the King of France, by the grace of God. Joan stood right beside him at the altar, holding her battle standard. It was the apex of her short life. In less than 6 months, an illiterate peasant girl had taken a disinherited fugitive and placed a crown on his head. But look closely at this triumphant moment. This is where the tragedy begins. As the holy oil dried on Charles's forehead, his demeanor changed subtly, but unmistakably. He had what he desperately wanted. He had the crown. He had the legitimacy. He had the divine anointing. What he didn't need anymore was a volatile, uncontrollable teenage mystic telling him what to do and overshadowing his authority. The mission was technically complete in his mind. For Joan, the coronation was just the beginning of the real work. She wanted to march immediately on Paris. She wanted to drive the English into the sea. She wanted to finish what God had started. But for Charles and his cautious advisors, it was time to negotiate, to consolidate, to be reasonable. They were politicians calculating advantages. She was a crusader following divine commands. They looked at her standing there in her shining armor, loved by the common people, feared by the enemy. And they didn't see a savior anymore. They saw a dangerous liability. The king began signing secret truces with the Duke of Burgundy behind her back. He cut funding for her military campaigns. The betrayal wasn't a dramatic knife in the dark. It was a slow, bureaucratic withdrawal of support. The phoenix had served its purpose. Now the ashes were beginning to cool. The road to Paris was wide open. After the coronation, the English were in complete disarray. If the French army had marched immediately on the capital with momentum, the 100 Years' War might have ended in 1429. But they didn't march. They waited. King Charles VII, now secure in his title, hesitated and delayed. He entered into a disastrous 15-day truce with the Duke of Burgundy, genuinely believing he could win Paris through diplomacy rather than bloodshed. This was a fatal miscalculation. While Charles negotiated pointlessly, the English and Burgundians used those 2 precious weeks to fortify the walls of Paris, dig new defensive trenches, and stockpile weapons and supplies. Joan was furious. She knew instinctively that in war, momentum is everything. You do not give a wounded enemy time to recover and breathe. Finally, after weeks of agonizing delay, the king grudgingly allowed her to attack Paris, but his support was half-hearted at best. He didn't really want her to succeed. On September 8th, 1429, on the feast of the Nativity of Mary, Joan stood before the massive walls of Paris at the Saint-Honoré gate. She didn't have the siege equipment she needed. She didn't have enough soldiers, but she attacked anyway because God had commanded it. The fighting was savage and desperate. Joan stood on the edge of the moat, shouting at the Parisians to surrender their city to the rightful King of France. Their response was a crossbow bolt. It struck her through the thigh, the steel point tearing through muscle and pinning her to the ground. Collapsing in the mud, bleeding heavily, she still refused to leave the field. For hours, as the sun set and darkness covered the battlefield, her voice could be heard from the ditch. screaming at the soldiers to fill the moat, to bring the scaling ladders, to push forward. She kept insisting that the city was theirs for the taking, but the commanders on the field, seeing their talisman fall, lost their nerve. Against her direct orders and screaming protests, they dragged her away from the walls and carried her to safety. She was crying in rage and frustration the entire way. The next morning, despite her painful wound, Joan ordered the trumpets to sound for another assault. She was ready to go back. She had a plan to attack the city from a different angle. She was already mounting her horse when the royal messenger arrived with sealed orders. The command came directly from King Charles VII. It was not reinforcements. It was a prohibition. The attack was permanently cancelled. The king ordered the entire army to retreat back to the Loire. To ensure Joan could not disobey him and attack Paris again on her own initiative, Charles ordered the bridge across the Seine at Saint-Denis to be destroyed. He literally burned the bridge to victory behind her back. The siege of Paris was a failure, but it was a deliberately manufactured failure. The king had sabotaged his own army to appease his Burgundian enemies. Following this humiliating defeat, the royal treatment of Joan shifted from active support to passive containment. Charles showered her with empty honors. He granted her entire family noble status. They became the Longform family. He gave her expensive clothes and a household. It was a golden cage. He was trying to retire her forcibly. He wanted her to be a symbol, a mascot to be paraded at feasts and used in propaganda, not a general commanding armies in the field. But Joan was not built for peace. She was a creature of the battlefield, driven by voices that didn't stop commanding. As the winter of 1429 set in, she watched helplessly as the English regrouped. The truces Charles had signed were predictably broken, just as she had warned. By the spring of 1430, the enemy was on the move again, targeting the strategic town of Compiègne. Joan didn't wait for the king's permission this time. She couldn't sit in a palace listening to politicians debate while her people were being slaughtered. In May 1430, with a small band of loyal volunteers, she rode out of the royal court without authorization to defend Compiègne. She was riding toward her doom. The king didn't try to stop her. In fact, many historians suspect he was quietly relieved to see her go. On May 23, 1430, the end began outside the walls of Compiègne. Joan led a sortie to attack the Burgundian siege camp. It was meant to be a quick hit-and-run operation, but enemy reinforcements arrived faster than expected. The French were suddenly outnumbered. They turned back toward the safety of the city walls. Joan, as always in battle, stayed at the rear to cover the retreat. She was the last one fighting, swinging her sword to buy time for her men to cross the bridge. She expected Guillaume de Flavy, the governor of the town, to keep the gate open for her. He didn't. With Joan and a handful of her soldiers still fighting desperately outside, the drawbridge began to rise. The iron portcullis slammed down with finality. She was trapped against the moat with an army of Burgundians closing in from all sides. To this day, historians fiercely debate whether Flavy panicked in the chaos, or whether he was following secret orders from the king to dispose of a troublesome general. A Burgundian archer grabbed her by her gold-embroidered coat and dragged her off her horse. She hit the ground hard. There was no divine intervention. No angels appeared with flaming swords to rescue her. There was only the mud, the shouting of soldiers, and the rough hands of men stripping her of her weapons. She was now the prisoner of John of Luxembourg, a vassal of the Duke of Burgundy. In the code of medieval chivalry, a high-ranking prisoner was a lottery ticket. You didn't kill valuable prisoners, you ransomed them back to their own side for cash. It was a business. The standard procedure was to offer the prisoner back to their own faction for payment. Joan waited in her cell for the offer to come from Charles. She waited for the king she had personally crowned to empty the royal treasury to save her. Weeks passed, then months. The silence from the French court was deafening. King Charles VII did absolutely nothing. He didn't offer a single franc. He didn't threaten military retaliation. He didn't even organize a prayer group. He simply ghosted her completely. To Charles, Joan was a tool that had served its purpose. A living martyr is dangerous and unpredictable. A dead martyr is useful and controllable. While Charles sat on his hands, the English were frantic with activity. They couldn't allow the Burgundians to keep her, and they certainly couldn't risk her being ransomed back to the French. They needed her specifically to put her on trial. They needed to legally prove that Charles VII had been crowned by a witch. If Joan was a witch, Charles was a heretic king, and his crown was illegitimate. Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, and a staunch English collaborator, was dispatched to broker the deal. He traveled to the Burgundian camp with a massive sum of money. The price for the Maid of Orleans was set at Dix 000 livres tournois. To put that in perspective, that was literally a king's ransom. It was enough money to equip and maintain a small army for months. Joan was bought and sold like a piece of high-value livestock. During her imprisonment in the castle of Beaurevoir, Joan grew desperate as she realized what was happening. She knew she was being sold to the English. In a moment of panic and desperation, she climbed to the top of the 60-foot tower and jumped. She crashed into the dry moat below. Miraculously, she didn't break any bones, though she was knocked unconscious and severely bruised for weeks. Later, at her trial, her prosecutors would claim this was a suicide attempt, a mortal sin proving demonic possession. Joan argued she was simply trying to escape, to go back to Compiègne to help defend it. Either way, it was the act of a terrified young woman, realizing that her former allies had abandoned her to the wolves. The deal was signed. The money changed hands. The Burgundians handed her over to the English. She was chained inside an iron cage and transported to Rouen. The battlefield was left behind. Now she faced a much more dangerous arena, a courtroom filled with men who had already decided the verdict before the trial began. The trial began on February 21st, 1431 inches, the Chapel Royal of Rouen Castle. It was deliberately designed to be a spectacle of intimidation. Bishop Cauchon presided over the ecclesiastical tribunal, flanked by nearly 70 doctors of theology, canon lawyers, and clerics. Picture the scene carefully. On high benches sat dozens of the most educated, powerful men in Europe, dressed in intimidating robes of expensive wool and fur. In the center of the room, on a small wooden stool, sat a 19-year-old prisoner in shackles. She had no lawyer to defend her. She had no witnesses to call. She was not allowed to present any defense. The goal of this trial of condemnation was not to find the truth. It was to prove a predetermined point. They needed to demonstrate that her voices were demons, that her male clothing was an abomination, and that her king was therefore a heretic. They threw everything at her for months. They bombarded her with complex theological traps, jumping between topics to confuse her, asking about fairies, about her virginity, about the specific dialect her saints spoke in. They were trying to catch her in a contradiction or heresy. Then came the killshot question. One of the interrogators asked her a question that was designed to be logically impossible to answer. Do you know yourself to be in God's grace? This was a masterpiece of legal malice. According to strict church doctrine, no human being could know for certain if they were in a state of grace. That was God's secret alone. If she answered yes, she was a heretic, claiming to know the unknowable mind of God. If she answered no, she was confessing to being a sinner, unprotected by grace, and therefore guilty. It was a perfect lose-lose trap. The court scribes poised their pens, ready to record her death sentence. Joan looked at them calmly and replied, "If I am not in God's grace, may God put me there, and if I am, may God keep me there." The court was stunned into silence. The scribe actually stopped writing mid-sentence. She had sidestepped the ultimate theological trap with a precision that would make a doctor of divinity envious. They were forced to adjourn the session immediately. The illiterate peasant had outsmarted the experts. Realizing they couldn't defeat her intellectually in open debate, Cauchon shifted tactics. He began a campaign of what we would today recognize as psychological torture and gaslighting. This wasn't just interrogation. It was the systematic dismantling of a person's reality. They kept her in a dark, freezing cell, chained by the neck, hands, and feet to a heavy wooden log. She was guarded 24/7 by English soldiers who mocked her constantly and threatened her with rape. They denied her the one thing she begged for desperately: Mass and the Eucharist. By cutting her off from the sacraments, they were telling her that God had already rejected her. They wanted her to believe she was already damned. They took her to the torture chamber and showed her the instruments, the rack, thumbscrews, the hot irons, explaining in detail what they would do to her. They told her repeatedly that her voices were delusions. They told her the king had forgotten her completely. They twisted her words until she was physically exhausted, sick, and terrified. The Inquisition records show a trial that dragged on for months. Joan's health began to fail. She was vomiting, feverish, likely from deliberate food poisoning or the horrific conditions of the cell. Yet, through it all, she refused to recant. She stuck to her story. "I have done nothing except by revelation," she insisted. Finally, having failed to prove she was a witch or heretic through testimony, they cornered her on a technicality that seems absurd to the modern mind: her wardrobe. The Bible in Deuteronomy 22:5 forbids women from wearing men's clothing. Joan refused to wear a dress in prison because her male clothing, with its many laces and tight fit, was her only physical defense against the groping hands of her guards. Cauchon offered her a simple choice: submit to the church, sign a confession, wear a dress, or burn alive. On May 24th, 1431, in the cemetery of Saint-Ouen, facing a screaming mob and the executioner waiting with his cart of wood, Joan's resolve finally cracked. Sick, terrified of the fire, and exhausted by months of psychological torture, she signed a document she couldn't even read. She agreed to stop wearing men's clothes. She was sentenced to perpetual imprisonment, with the bread of sorrow and the water of affliction. She had saved her life, but she felt she had lost her soul. She had signed the paper. She was alive. But back in her cell, the reality of her mercy set in. She was to be locked in darkness forever, chained to a block of wood, eating only bread and water, listening to the constant insults of her guards. 3 days later, on May 28th, Bishop Cauchon entered her cell and stopped dead in his tracks. Joan was no longer wearing the dress. She was back in her male clothing, the tunic and hose. Why? Some historical accounts suggest the guards deliberately stole her dress during the night and left her only the male clothing, forcing her to put them on to cover her naked body. Others suggest she put them on voluntarily as a shield when the guards tried to rape her. But Joan's own words to the bishop suggest something deeper and more profound. She looked at him and retracted her confession. "I damned myself to save my life," she said. She had realized that denying her truth was a fate worse than the fire. Cauchon didn't try to save her this time. He rushed out of the prison, reportedly shouting to the English commanders, "Farewell, be of good cheer. It is done." They had finally trapped her. By returning to men's clothes, she was technically a relapsed heretic. The penalty for relapse was automatic death by burning. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, they dressed her in a long white shift, like a bride. They placed a tall paper mitre on her head, where it read in large letters, "Heretic, relapsed, apostate, idolater." She was led barefoot to the old market square. The English had built the pyre unusually high, placing the stake on top of a tall plaster scaffold. This was deliberate. It meant the executioner could not reach her to strangle her first. The customary mercy that spared condemned prisoners the agony of burning alive. They wanted her to feel everything. As she climbed the ladder, the massive crowd began to weep. Even hardened English soldiers were visibly unsettled. She asked for a cross to hold. An English soldier, moved by unexpected pity, broke a stick in two, tied the pieces together with string, and handed it to her. She kissed it and shoved it into her dress against her skin. When the fire was lit, she didn't scream curses at her enemies. She didn't beg for her life. She screamed one word over and over again through the smoke until her voice gave out. Jesus! 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 She died at 19 years old. Her body was reduced to ash and bone, but as the executioner Geoffroy raked through the remains, he found what shouldn't be there. The heart. It was intact, full of blood, untouched by flames. Terrified, he threw it in the Seine. Her story was supposed to end there, erased. But you cannot burn a legacy. 25 years later, in 1456, the war was finally over. The French had won. King Charles VII, now secure on his throne, realized he had a serious PR problem. He had been crowned by a woman officially condemned as a witch and heretic. To clean up his own reputation and legitimacy, he ordered a retrial, the nullification trial. Papal commissioners traveled to Domremy, Orléans, and Rouen. They interviewed over 100 surviving witnesses, her childhood friends, the old soldiers who fought beside her, even the scribes who had recorded her original trial. The truth came pouring out in testimony after testimony. The court declared the original 1,431 trial corrupt, illegal, and completely void. They described Joan as a martyr and declared Bishop Cauchon himself a heretic. It was total vindication. But it was also one final cynical use of Joan by the monarchy. Even in death, she remained a political tool. So what are we to make of Joan of Arc? 500 years later, the Catholic Church canonized her as a saint. Today, she's held up as a feminist icon, a nationalist symbol, and a pop culture legend. But strip away the halo and the statues and the propaganda, and you're left with something far more compelling and human. You're left with a teenage girl who saw the world as it was broken, violent, unjust, and seemingly hopeless, and decided she could fix it. She didn't wait for permission from men. She didn't wait for someone else to save her. She stepped into the fire because she believed in something bigger than her own survival. In a world that constantly tells us we are too small, too young, too powerless, too female to make a difference, the girl from Domremy offers a terrifying, beautiful counterargument. She proves that conviction, when pure enough and strong enough, can bend reality itself. But let's be clear-eyed about what actually happened. Let's separate the legend from the history. Was Joan really guided by divine voices? Or was she a military genius created by the extreme pressure of her time? The honest answer is, we cannot know with certainty. What we do know is that her tactical decisions were often brilliant. At Orléans, she understood instinctively what modern military theorists would later codify: the importance of morale, the power of offensive action, the need to seize initiative. At Patay, she pushed for aggressive pursuit when conventional wisdom said to consolidate. She was right. The English were caught unprepared and slaughtered. Her insistence on crowning Charles at Reims was politically genius. Legitimacy matters. Symbols matter. A king anointed at Reims carried weight that a king of Bourges never could. These weren't the decisions of a delusional teenager. These were calculated, strategic moves that changed the course of a century-long war. But here's the paradox. Would anyone have listened to her strategic genius if she hadn't claimed divine authority? In the rigid hierarchy of medieval France, a peasant girl offering military advice would have been laughed out of the room. But a peasant girl claiming to speak for God, confirmed by signs and miracles, became impossible to ignore. The voices, real or imagined, were the only possible source of authority available to her. They were her credentials in a world that would never have accepted her otherwise. So perhaps the question isn't whether the voices were real in a supernatural sense. Perhaps the question is, did it matter? The results were real. The siege was broken. The king was crowned. The war turned. France survived. Whether the mechanism was divine intervention or psychological conviction channeled into military genius, the outcome was the same. But we should also confront the darker parallels. Joan was not the only person in history to hear voices commanding violence. Religious extremists throughout history have claimed divine mandates to kill. The 9/11 hijackers believed they were serving God. Crusaders slaughtered in Christ's name. How do we distinguish Joan's voices from theirs? The answer matters. I would argue the distinction lies in the context and the outcome. Joan fought a defensive war to liberate her occupied homeland from foreign invaders. She wept for the souls of enemies she killed. She tried to minimize civilian casualties. She followed the laws of war as they existed. When she had power, she didn't use it to massacre or oppress. Compare that to religious terrorists who deliberately target civilians, who glory in cruelty, who seek to impose their will on unwilling populations. The difference is not in the claim of divine authority. Both claim that. The difference is in the ethics of how that authority is exercised. Joan's voices, whatever their source, led her to be a surprisingly ethical warrior for the medieval period. But let's also acknowledge the tragedy. Joan was used. The Dauphin needed a miracle, and she provided one. Once he had his crown, he discarded her. The church needed a scapegoat, and she became one. Once the political winds changed, they rehabilitated her. She was a tool for men who feared and resented her power. This pattern repeats throughout history. Powerful women are useful when they serve male interests, dangerous when they don't. Joan broke every gender rule of her society. She cut her hair. She wore armor. She commanded men. She spoke with authority. And for a brief moment, because they were desperate enough, men allowed it. But the moment her usefulness ended, they reasserted control. They put her in a dress, put her on trial, and put her in the fire. The trial itself reveals the mechanisms of power. Bishop Cauchon and his collaborators weren't stupid. They knew she wasn't actually a witch. Witches didn't exist, but they needed her to be a witch for political purposes. So they constructed a legal process that had the appearance of justice but was designed to produce only one outcome. This is how show trials work, whether in medieval France, Stalinist Russia, or modern authoritarian states. The verdict is predetermined. The process is theater, designed to legitimize what has already been decided. Joan's brilliance during the trial was that she refused to play along. When they tried to trap her with the state of grace question, she found the escape hatch. When they tried to confuse her with theological complexity, she spoke simple truth. She understood intuitively what they were doing and refused to cooperate with her own destruction. Until, broken by torture and fear, she briefly did. Her recantation is the most human moment in the story. For months she held firm, but when they took her to the cemetery, showed her the stake, and she smelled the wood being prepared, she broke. She signed the paper. This doesn't make her weak. It makes her human. Torture works. Psychological warfare works. The human spirit can only endure so much before it cracks. What's remarkable is not that she broke. It's that 3 days later, she unbroken herself. She took back her recantation. She chose the fire. Why? Because she realized that living as a lie was worse than dying as herself. I damned myself to save my life. In that moment, chained in a cell, she chose integrity over survival. This is the heart of her story. Not the battles, not the miracles, but that choice. In the medieval world, identity was fixed by birth. Peasants were peasants. Women were women. The hierarchy was ordained by God and unchangeable. Joan shattered that. She claimed the right to define herself. She insisted that her voices, her mission, her identity were real, regardless of what the bishop said. In modern language, we might say, she insisted on living her truth even when it killed her. This resonates today. How many people are forced to deny their true selves to survive? How many people live as lies because the truth is too dangerous? Joan's choice to reclaim her identity at the cost of her life speaks across 6 centuries to anyone who has ever had to choose between safety and authenticity. But let's also grapple with the violence. Joan was a warrior. She killed people. She led armies that burned enemy soldiers alive in fortresses. The medieval laws of war were brutal. Sieges ended in massacre. Prisoners were ransomed or killed. War was total. Joan participated in this system. She was not a pacifist saint bringing peace. She was a warrior saint bringing victory through violence. This complicates the narrative. We want our heroes pure. But Joan was a medieval person fighting a medieval war. She believed in just war theory, that violence in defense of the innocent and to restore justice was not only permissible, but commanded by God. By that standard, liberating occupied France from foreign invaders was just. But we should be honest about what that involved. Men died screaming. Villages burned. The liberation was not bloodless. The parallels to modern conflicts are unavoidable. When is violent resistance to occupation justified? The French resistance in World War II is celebrated. So is the American Revolution. But other resistance movements are labeled terrorism. What's the difference? Joan forces us to confront these questions. If she's a saint for violently resisting English occupation, what about Palestinians resisting Israeli occupation? What about Ukrainian resistance to Russian invasion? What about any occupied people taking up arms? The easy answer is that our side is always just, and their side is always terrorism. Joan challenges that simplicity. She was called a terrorist by the English. She was called a saint by the French. She was the same person doing the same things. The label depended on which side you were on. Perhaps the lesson is that we should judge actions by ethics and context, not by who does them. Did Joan fight defensively or offensively? Did she target soldiers or civilians? Did she follow the laws of war or commit atrocities? Did she seek justice or revenge? By these standards, her record is relatively clean for medieval warfare. She was a soldier, but an ethical one by the standards of her time. The gender dimension cannot be ignored. A male commander doing exactly what Joan did would have been unremarkable. Plenty of teenage boys led armies in the Middle Ages, but a teenage girl? That was impossible, intolerable, world-breaking. The English literally could not process it. Their propaganda called her a witch, a whore, a hermaphrodite, anything except what she was, a woman exercising power. The trial obsessed over her clothing, not her military decisions or her theology, but her pants. She wore pants. She cut her hair. She rejected the performance of femininity. This was treated as equivalent to heresy. In Deuteronomy 22:5, cross-dressing is mentioned once. It's not one of the 10 Commandments. It's a minor purity law in a book full of them. But it became the central charge because it was really about enforcing gender hierarchy. If a woman could command men, wear armor, and wield authority, what was to stop other women from demanding the same? Joan was burned, not because she wore pants, but because she refused to accept that her gender disqualified her from public power. Every woman who has been told she's too aggressive, too ambitious, too masculine, is echoing Joan. Every person who has been told their gender expression is inappropriate or dangerous is echoing Joan. The trial was fundamentally about enforcing gender norms through violence. Wear the dress or burn. Submit or die. Joan chose to burn. The legacy is complicated. France adopted her as a nationalist symbol, but she fought for a feudal monarchy, not the French Republic. Feminists claim her, but she was deeply religious in ways modern feminism often isn't. The Catholic Church canonized her, but the Catholic Church also burned her. The far right claims her as a symbol of ethnic nationalism, which is grotesque given that she fought for political loyalty, not ethnic purity. Everyone wants to own Joan. Everyone wants her to validate their cause. But she belongs to history, not to propaganda. What she actually represents is the power and danger of conviction. She believed absolutely in her mission. That conviction gave her power to achieve the impossible. It also made her inflexible and ultimately self-destructive. She could have lived. She could have worn the dress, stayed in prison, and eventually been released or ransomed. She chose death instead because compromise felt like damnation. Is that admirable or tragic? Both. It's admirable that she valued integrity over survival. It's tragic that the world gave her no other option. It's admirable that she stood firm in her truth. It's tragic that her truth required her death. We romanticize martyrdom, but martyrs are failures. They failed to survive. They failed to find a third option between compromise and death. Joan is a martyr, which means she's a failure. A glorious, world-changing failure, but a failure nonetheless. If she'd been wiser, more flexible, more political, she might have lived to old age, but then she wouldn't have been Joan. The fire at Rouen was supposed to be the end. Erase the body, erase the memory, erase the threat. But the English miscalculated. Burning her transformed her from a military problem into an eternal symbol. Dead martyrs are more powerful than living commanders. The body dies, but the story spreads. Within days, rumors of miracles began. The heart that wouldn't burn. Witnesses who saw her soul ascending as a white dove. The executioner who confessed to murdering a saint. These stories spread faster than the English could suppress them. The rehabilitation trial in 1456 was politically motivated. Charles VII needed to legitimize his crown by delegitimizing her conviction. But the testimony recorded is invaluable. We hear from people who knew her. Her childhood friends described her as normal, pious, hardworking, kind. The soldiers described her as fearless and inspiring. Even hostile witnesses admitted she was remarkable. This testimony humanizes her. She wasn't a perfect plaster saint. She had a temper. She swore occasionally. She cried when wounded. She was afraid of the fire. She was human. That makes her achievements more remarkable, not less. The canonization in 1920 completed the transformation. The teenage girl burned as a heretic was now officially Saint Joan, patron saint of France. The church that killed her now worshipped her. The irony is staggering. But it also demonstrates how institutions rewrite history to serve present needs. The Catholic Church in 1920 needed nationalist heroes to compete with secularism. Joan, properly sanitized and reframed, fit perfectly. The real Joan, the one who argued with bishops and refused male authority, was buried under layers of hagiography. We don't have many of her actual words. Most of what we know comes from trial transcripts recorded by hostile scribes, but what we have is remarkable. Her answers are sharp, clever, defiant. She refuses to be intimidated. She finds loopholes in theological traps. She speaks truth to power, even when power holds her life in its hands. These words, preserved by her enemies, are her real legacy. Not the statues or the myths, but her voice. The modern world struggles with Joan. She doesn't fit our categories. She's religious in an increasingly secular world. She's a warrior in a peace-focused age. She claimed divine authority in a time of skepticism. She was a woman who commanded men in ways that still make people uncomfortable. She wore armor and pants and cut her hair, but she wasn't transgender. Gender identity, as we understand it, didn't exist as a concept then. She was a virgin warrior, which is a category that no longer makes sense. We try to claim her for our causes, but she resists. She's too medieval, too Catholic, too violent, too strange. Maybe that's okay. Maybe historical figures don't need to validate our modern politics. Maybe Joan is valuable precisely because she's alien to us. She shows us a radically different way of being in the world. She reminds us that conviction, passion, and courage existed before modern ideologies. She demonstrates that the struggle for self-definition against powerful institutions is ancient. The fire consumed her body. The executioner tried to hide the evidence. But 600 years later, we're still talking about the teenage girl from Domremy who heard voices and changed history. That's a kind of immortality, not the religious kind. She's not literally alive, but the cultural kind. As long as people tell her story, study her life, debate her meaning, she lives. The English wanted her forgotten. Instead, she became unforgettable. What would Joan make of her legacy? Probably nothing good. She didn't fight for feminist movements or nationalist ideology. She fought because God told her to save France. She would likely be horrified by how her image has been used by the Nazis who claimed her, by the anti-clerical Republicans who celebrated her, by modern activists who appropriate her. She was a medieval Catholic who believed in saints and miracles and the divine right of kings. She would find our world incomprehensible and probably demonic. But that's the nature of legacy. We don't control how we're remembered. Joan has been dead for 593 years. She has no say in what her story means now. We take from history what we need, and what people need from Joan varies. Teenage girls fighting for autonomy see a role model. Occupied peoples see hope. Religious people see faith validated. Skeptics see psychological genius. Everyone finds something. Perhaps the truest thing we can say is this: Joan of Arc was a human being who did extraordinary things in terrible circumstances. She heard voices, whether divine, psychological, or something else entirely. She convinced powerful men to follow her. She won battles. She crowned a king. She was captured, tried, and executed. She died young and terrified, crying out for Jesus in the smoke. And somehow, that death didn't end her story. It began it. The fire at Rouen consumed flesh and bone, but lit a flame that has burned for 6 centuries. The executioner threw her heart in the Seine, but her courage flows through history like that river flows to the sea. She proves that one person, armed with nothing but conviction, can bend the arc of history. She proves that the powerless can become powerful if they refuse to accept their powerlessness. She proves that integrity matters more than survival. She proves that the impossible is possible until it's done. These are dangerous lessons. They're the kind of lessons that get people killed. Joan died because she believed them, but she also changed the world because she believed them. So what's the answer? Divine intervention or genius under pressure? Saint or psychotic? Hero or cautionary tale? Maybe all of the above. Maybe the question is too simple for a life this complex. Maybe Joan of Arc is what she's always been, a mystery. A teenage girl who appeared from nowhere, did the impossible, and vanished into fire. A Rorschach test where we see what we need to see. A legend that outgrew the facts and became something larger. The only certainty is this: 600 years later, we're still trying to understand her. We're still arguing about her. We're still inspired by her. We're still afraid of what she represents. The English tried to erase her. Instead, they made her immortal. Not because of what she did, though her achievements were remarkable, but because of who she was. A girl who refused to be told who she could be. A peasant who commanded kings. A teenager who changed history. A voice crying out from the fire. This is who I am, and you cannot make me say otherwise. If this story moved you, share it. Joan's story survives because people keep telling it. And let me know in the comments. Do you think Joan was guided by divine intervention? Or was she a genius created by the pressure of her time? Was her conviction admirable or self-destructive? If you lived in her world, would you have followed her? I'll see you in the next video. Until then, remember, the impossible is impossible until someone does it. The fire burns the body, but not the truth. And sometimes, just sometimes, teenage girls change the world.